Okay, and we are ready to go. Okay, so we're coming back after a little bit of a break over here. A recap, because this actually is important in terms of understanding the progression. To recap a little bit on the last os that we did os mem, which, as the Rav explains, the word mem itself referring to mayim, the waterness of the progression of the different tsuros, of the different forms, that there is a flowing interconnectivity that is brought to the fore that allows a seamless progression between different elements. And we gave the parable when you are stringing together a complex process. So there's the different steps of the process that each individual step needs to be practiced and honed and perfected. But then there's an additional element which is beyond any particular step, but it's the ability to seamlessly move between the different steps, the different components. And that is the mayimness, the waterness, the flowness of the process as a whole. We talked about how cognitively we experience this when a person becomes too fixated on a particular step in the process, right? In the common parlance, it's called choking. Again, not choking like choking on food, God forbid, but choking in like you have rigidity, you're not able to flow. Lacking flow means you're hyper focused on the steps, but the connecting between the steps, you become completely incapacitated. So it's that cognitive experience you can understand. That is a state of lacking this memness, lacking the mayimness, lacking the flowness. So we talked about that, and that is obviously a more klali, a more general and unifying theme that comes out in the letters. And Rav Kook takes this opportunity to clarify that within the progression of the letters, it's not like we haven't talked about this until this point, but here he makes it explicit that there is a dichotomy of sorts, let's say, that switches off between the different letters, that some letters are more prati associated, some are more dealing with the world of the subjective and the individual and the specifics, and some letters are more klali, they're dealing with general themes, generalities, unifying energies. So whereas the mem is very much a unifying energy, that's the nature of it, it's the flow that allows the disparate parts to interconnect, that's the mem energy. The nun energy is now going back to the more prati, the more specification, let's say, prati type energy. However, it's a bit of a paradox, as the Rav will explain. The nun is, and again, this is very, very matim for Sfirat HaOmer, the nun, the energy of the nun, is the experience of the individual as he relates to the generality, as he relates to the collective. And we'll try to hash that out as much as possible. Although that sounds very general, but we'll try to express that as best as we can. I wanted to open up with a pasuk from over here, with a few psukim from Sefer Eov in Perek Chav Tes. So in the 29th chapter of Sefer Eov, Vayosef Eov se'es mishalo vayomar. The context of this parak is that Eov is recounting his experience that he had before all these tragedies befell him, after he got very, very ill and he lost his family. Right? So the life that he lived before the tragedies befell him, in contrast to the life that he's living now. So he says, "Mi itneni ki yarche kedem." Who will bring me back to the months of old? Ki yemei Eloah yishmereni, in the days that God was watching over me. Who will bring me back to those days? Behilo nero ale roshi, when there was a light above my head. Hilo. Right? In Lashon HaKodesh, there are a few words that connote light. There's or, obviously, noga, right? That's another word. Hilo, the root, hey lamed, is a root in Lashon HaKodesh that connotes light, which is, I'm sure you're already racing ahead, which is the root of the word halo. The word halo comes from that. In fact, it's very much inspired by this very verse, Hilo ale roshi, the halo above my head. It's literally right there in the thing. So that is the source for this. And the word hilo means like the shining candle above my head. La'oro eleich choshech, and by the light of this candle, by the light of the candle of Hashem that is lit above my head, I was able to walk in all matters of darkness. It gave me clarity. It gave me direction. God was guarding me. It was great. That's the description that Eov gives. Now, these psukim, regardless of the content that Eov is now going to talk about in right, in later verses. These two opening psukim of this chapter are used by Chazal to describe famously the experience of the fetus inside the womb. That this is because he describes this period of his life in a strange way. He says, "Meet neni ki yarchei kedem." Who will bring me back to the months of old? Typically, the idiom is, "Who will bring me back the shnos kedem, to the years of old, or the days of old?" What does that mean? The months of old. What's the months? So it says the Gemara, what period of a person's existence is quantified in months as opposed to days or years? And that period is the period, right, is the period of in utero. This is a implicit reference to that period of time where a person is coming into existence and not fully formed. Right? He's in utero. So it's describing this experience. Bihilo nero ale roshi, that there was a light above my head. And Chazal say in the Gemara Nida that there is that the fetus inside the womb has this divine inspiration, this light above his head, that through this light, roa misofa olam yad sofo, he experiences, the fetus experiences the totality of existence, and as a result of experiencing the totality of existence, lo midas kol haTorah kulo, he imbibes, so to speak, he inculcates into his consciousness the entire Torah. And eventually, when it's time for the fetus to be born, ba malach v'sosra al piv, there is an angelic being that comes and strikes him on the mouth, and as a result of that strike on the mouth, the child forgets the entire Torah and emerges into the world as a helpless infant who knows nothing. And we spoke about this in our opening shir in the context of how the very power of speech, the strike on the mouth is giving forth to the child the ability to speak. That very paradigm of articulation, of enunciation, of being able to speak in compartmentalized words, that very paradigm cuts the person's consciousness off from the divine world of Torah, and it requires a rebuilding period. Instead of focusing on that particular point, I want to focus on the point before. At this Halo Ale Roshi, there's this experience of the light above the person's head, which is described as Nero, the candle of God. It's the candle of God above the person's head. And with that light, there is an access point to a dimension which is above the dimension of the person as an individual. It's the pre-individual. It's the dimension from which the individual emerges from. It's not the individual, it's the source of the individual. As we've talked about recently, we brought another pasuk that refers to the candle of God, the more famous verse that refers to the candle of God from Sefer Mishlei. Iner Hashem nishmas adam. So this is like as explicit as you can get, that this candle above his head, this halo above his hand, is the divine soul, the divine form being given to the human being. To take this just a step further and to connect it to the themes that are going to be associated with the letter that we're going to talk about. So we know, the more mystically inclined, I know that you are all seasoned Kabbalah, so you're probably familiar with these ideas, right? That there are different words that are used in Lashon HaKodesh to refer to the soul. And in the classical mystical literature, the soul is typically divided into 5 different. Now, why is that? Because there are 5 different distinct words that are used in the Tanakh to describe the soul. Right? Some are more common, some are less common, but there are 5 words that are used to describe the soul. Nefesh is probably the most common. Nefesh, which is the part of us that we share in common with animals. Animals also have a nefesh, as it says explicitly. That's why you put the blood on the mizbeach, because that's where the nefesh is. The nefesh is contained within the animal. So the part that we share in common with animals is called the nefesh, which is the most corporal, most boots on the ground, so to speak, part of the soul, the part of the soul that Ki'ilu makes contact with the world. Above that is the ruach, which is also at very, very pshat level. We don't need to go into any mystical sources in order to hash this out. The ruach is associated with the emotional realm. The ruach is what animates you. The ruach is what the spirit animates you. It gives you the direction, it gives you the drive, it gives you the motivation. We see that person can have a ruach ra. Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, had a ruach ra. There was a spirit that possessed him, that made him do things that he wouldn't have otherwise done. A person could have a ruach hakodesh. A person could have a Holy Spirit. Right? So the ruach is associated with the emotional world as the thing that animates you. Above that is the neshama. We see that that's actually the earliest term to describe what's unique to the human being. That God gives a nishmas chayim to the first human being, which is what makes him distinct from all other creatures. The nishmas chayim is what is associated with the world of the intellect. The world of the intellect is nishmas chayim. Now these 3 levels, these 3 levels of the soul, what puts them in a category of themselves is that they are associated with the individual as such, meaning a person has a nefesh, a ruach, and a neshama. They are unique to that person, to him or her. The levels above that, the levels above those first three levels, are already transcending the conscious identity. That's the term I wanted to use. The conscious identity of the individual as an individual, and are already going back, reverting back to associating with the pre-individual state, meaning the source from which the person came. And the terms that are used to describe these different dimensions, these two higher dimensions, are chaya and yechida. Right? Chaya is also one of the first terms used to describe the soul. Right? The vayiha adam lenefesh chaya, that the man was a living soul. So the living aspect of the soul, the thing that revivifies the person and gives them life, is called the chaya. And the yechida, which is taken from a pasuk in the Sefer Tehillim, Mekelev yechida si, God should save my yechida from the clawing dog. Yeah, I mean, there are people after David HaMelech trying to chase him down, right? He was an enemy of the state. So he's praying to God, save my yechida from all my enemies. The yechida is a term to describe the soul. The yechida, why is the yechida called the yechida? Because it is a term that is describing unification, like yechid, like all-togetherness. And again, these two dimensions of the soul, the distinction between them is not so germane to the conversation, but the part that is relevant is that these levels of the soul are already places of consciousness that a person does not relate to themselves as a distinct, differentiated individual. Rather, they are 100% and completely aware of the fact that they are just part of a grand, bigger whole. These are these are states of consciousness. States of consciousness. And what's unique to the neshama, going back 2 steps, what's unique to the neshama is that the neshama is ki'ilu. It's not ki'ilu. It is the go-between that sits at the tavech. What's a good word for tavech? We have our translator here. At the border, let's say, between the consciousness of the individual. It sits at the border of the consciousness of the individual, the distinct individual, the I, the id, so to speak, right? The I, the ego, and the general universal consciousness. It sits between that. And that is why the neshama is described as the light hovering above my head. It's not in me, it's not in my head, it's hovering above my head. Meaning it's attached to my head, but it's not in my head. It's like in between. Right? The halo it's somewhere in between. It's the thing that attaches me to the rest of everything. It's my access point, so to speak, to connecting to the collective consciousness of all being. That is the hilo ale roshi. And it is this point that is this idea of the access point between the individual relating to him or herself as an individual, accessing the collective consciousness, which is the nun. That's the nun. The individual being aware that they are at the borderline of the collective. And Bezrat Hashem, we will explain to the best of our ability what that means and practically what the ramifications are. We're going to read a fascinating section from the Maharal that relates to this. Bezrat Hashem. Excuse me?
So sometimes slightly different phrasing. That's a common theme throughout these letters.
Theme throughout which letters?
Individual versus
Oh yes, absolutely. As we said, this is actually the time where Rav Kook takes the opportunity to say explicitly something that we've come across many times, that a theme throughout the progression of the letters is that we're oscillating back and forth between more prati oriented themes and more klali oriented things, more specific oriented and more generalized, unified orienting. Okay, so let's jump into the text of Rav Kook. So Hanun b'mivta, the nun in its enunciation, meaning the word nun, mefanehi et higyono shel orach hayim asher hu mizdareach menukudat hamiyuchadot. It is turning us to contemplate the light of life as it shines forth in the specific points, nikudot hamiyuchadot, me'otzar hashetaf haklali, that are emerging from the general flow, yesod hamimi, which is the wateriness, the waterness, the flowness that we talked about before. So whereas the flow, water energy of the mem is the shetef haklali, it's the flow, it's the general flow, very generalized, unifying collective energy. The nun are the specific nikudot, the specific points of life that emerge from that.
Like a plant.
Huh?
Like a plant being poured with water and allowed to grow individual.
So he's not going to use a plant as his mashal. He's going to use a fish as his mashal. Why is he going to use a fish as his mashal? Can you get? Also visually, that's true because there are little points of life in the big water. That's true. But for even more of a reason, they get disconnected. They're dead. That's also true. He's going to hit on that as well, like thematically. But I'm saying even more simply, the word nun in Aramaic. Right, yeah. So Herschel helped us out. The word nun in Aramaic means fish.
That was the second thing I was going
to say. Yeah. The word nun in Aramaic actually means fish. So hamusagim, hatzirim, hachafetzim, all of the thoughts and ideas and forms and yearnings and aspirations, bihitnasam lemoromei hachlala, when they are elevated into hachlala, into unification, into integration, bihikavam b'tzuratam hashotefet va'ahuma, they are all brought together in this flowiness, hahuma, which makes the say the roaring noise of the collective. I think he's referring back to the pasuk that he quoted from Sefer Tehillim in the last letter, Mikolot Mayim Rabim Adirim, that when the waters come together, the mighty waters, they all integrate and come into this collective, they yell out a mighty roar. Hare ha'ara ha'klalit, this illumination of the klal, of the generality, of the unification, omedet ba be'efes tfisa pratit. The problem with it, or let's say the lacking in it, is that there's no grasp of individuality there. It's so general and it's so flowing. The flow is so powerful, the flow energy, that all individuals lose their individual sense of self. But through that flow now emerges the specific points of life, which are Degei Hayam, the fish of the sea. B'toar mu'urpal hina mitraim. They are being alluded to in a mu'urpal. What's a good word for mu'urpal? Hidden or slightly concealed, perhaps. They're being referred to in a concealed manner. How they were being referred to in the nun in a concealed manner, because nun is Aramaic. It's not Hebrew. And as we've discussed in other letters, the difference between Lashon HaKodesh and Lashon Targum is Lashon HaKodesh is going to the essence of the thing, whereas Lashon Targum is describing things in an intentionally superficial way. So nun is the word for fish in a superficial, let's say, more concealed way. Besfat HaTargum, in the language of the Targum, i.e. Aramaic, hashoevet et ora mehamekoriut, which draws its life from the place of authenticity, ha'etana, the strong, mitgaleh tochen hadagi, is revealed the content of the fishness being right, fishy, and the fishiness, the dag again being the nekudot hachayim, the points of life that emerge from the water-like flow. Hanun hitgalut hachayim hamerubabim. So the nun is the revelation of the multitude, let's say, of life. Mitoch ha'otzar hamazhir kulo ba'or neguhot meruvavot, which shines forth from all of the shining of the lights as they coalesce into their multitude. Me'uchadot u'me'urganot, they become unified and organized. Memochiot lemezeg achduti malei shetef va'az, they come into a flow, the mezeg achduti, which is unified, malei shetef va'oz, with tremendous strength. Machricha hi et hachayim la'amod b'milchama. And now that the individual points of life emerge from this general flow, now all the individual points of life, what do they need to do? It causes them, it gives them the impetus to stand and fight. What is this going back to? The theme that we discussed in Os Zion. Os Zion was the first time that we encountered this idea that once that a critical stage of development of the individual, where it's coming into full consciousness and full self-awareness, is that it becomes aware of its own will to fight for its survival. That's the Zion, which means both to give nutrition and to give sustenance, and it also means to fight. It means a weapon of war. So as these individual points of life are now emerging from the Shetef HaKlali, from the general flow, they have an impetus to fight. we see that the Zion makes a comeback, so to speak, in the Os Nun, just visually. Right, the top part of the Nun is literally a Zion. Yeah. Bechlei halechem, which also brings forth the tools of bread, i.e., the tools of sustenance. Milchamot Hashem, in order to fight the wars of God. Ba'olam hamada v'hamusar, in all disparate areas of life, which includes the science and it includes the ethical spheres. B'hayitzira ruchanit, with creativity and in spirituality. Ha'igayon v'hashira, with in the areas of logic and in the areas of arts like poetry. And all of their blooming manifestations. So to be able to fight and self-express in all of the disparate areas of life. Zot tavlit tzurat hazayin shebanoi berosha, and all this is alluded to in the form of the Zion that makes the top part of the Nun. And the top part of the Nun, or the entire top part except for the base, is essentially a Zion. V'hatzad hakafi shebetachtit, and the other part of the Nun, the bottom part, is basically a miniature chaf. Right? It's making it a miniature chaf, so to speak. Hu yoreh lanu. In fact, this is coming to mind as I'm saying this. One of the issues that the poskim encounter with I'm saying from the halachic side, the most common problem that is found with the Os Nun is that if it's written incorrectly, it bears too much of a similarity to a chaf and therefore is invalid. Meaning if the top part extends too far to the left, for example, the bottom part extends too far to the left, it looks too similar to a chaf, is invalid. So at the same time, you have the Zion being alluded to in the top part, and you also have a chaf-like form being written out in the letter. Hu yoreh lanu lo et ha'ashlama hamifalit v'hagbala. It is alluding to not the full expression of mifalit v'hachbala, of acting out, and hagbalata is like creating borders. Kitzurat hakaf hashlema, which is the form of the full kaf. If you remember in Os Kaf, we talked about how kaf is alluding to the kaf hamoznayim, the scales, which is the stage of development where people are able to measure different values against each other and make decisions despite the fact that there are contradictory values. That's what we talked about in Os Kaf. So if Kook is saying it's not the full Os Kaf, because that's not the primary theme that we're dealing with. Rather, a miniature kaf that is hidden in the individual point. So it's like it's both the general energy of the mayim, the water, right? The general energy where there are no contradictions because there's no hitnagdut, there's no disparate energies being conflicted against each other. But at the same time, there's individuality emerging from that water, right? That's the fish thing, right? The fish theme, right? So there is the miniature kaf emerging with each individual point. שהוא נטוע בעומק החיים, העושה על ידי ההכשר אל המפעל את כל מהות וצורתם, להמון רבה של ריבי רבבות, in the mighty cry of all of the multitudes emerging, סוגי סוגים, all the different types, של עולמי עולמים אין קץ. תיאור 50 שערי בינה, מקור יצירת הנשמות. All of this is describing the 50 gates of Bina, the 50 gates of understanding, which are the source, Makor Yitzirat HaNeshamot, the source of all individual souls. So this whole description that we talked about of this raging water, this flow, and from the raging flow of water can emerge the specific points of life. That whole theme is what Chazal call the 50 gates of understanding. The 50 gates of understanding, which is the source of the individual souls. What's the 50th gate of understanding? 50th gate of understanding is all of reality being unified in a perfect unity. That's the 50th gate of understanding.
Living as an individual.
So that's the thing. You can't be an individual and be in the 50th gate at the same time. That's the problem. Right? When Moshe Rabbeinu requests, and we read this recently, right, in Parshas Ki Sisa, when Moshe requests to know God's ways, right, and God says to him, I can't show you my face because no man can live and see my face. So Chazal say this is what was going on. He was requesting access to the 50th gate. to know the totality, to know the ultimate answer to everything, right? The theory of everything, how there are no contradictions, how there's no disparate themes crashing into each other. There's just a perfect unity. So God says to Moshe, you can't know that because that is what makes my consciousness distinct from human consciousness. Human consciousness is subjective by nature. We experience the world through ourselves, which is what God wants. God wants individuals to experience the world through their subjective self. He doesn't want another totalizing worldview. He wants the individual to come and bring their own individual self to the table. So you can't access the 50th gate and be yourself at the same time. It's inherently contradictory. I think we could have the Yerushalmi over here. Yerushalmi and Sanhedrin. I'm sure we've brought this in other contexts.
So Nun kind of reminds me a little bit of hay, where you're kind of like trying to be in the Goldilocks zone, so to speak, of and there's this wave from everyone else, and you're kind of dancing, and you're kind of keeping your distance, but at the same time you can't go too far away because you can't separate yourself from
Yes,
Tehillah.
yes,
Okay?
yes.
So Zion's I'm standing and fighting, but I also
Right.
have the.
Did you mention the thing about how the fish can't get out of the water? Like they can't. Right. The fish can't leave the water.
Right.
So while the fish are not the water, they're not the water. They're distinct from the water, but they need to be in the water in order to live. Yeah. So it's the idea that the individual is ultimately tied to its context. While the individual is the individual, it's ultimately tied to the context. If it's completely ripped and disassociated from the context, it will die.
So
Yeah.
Nun is the neshama, which is the gateway between the everything into condensing into the individual, which is the chaya, which is so it's kind of like it allows the expression to go. Is that kind of what we're looking at?
It allows individual expression while remaining consciously aware of the general context from which it came.
But not experiencing it.
Yes, experiencing it.
But that's the 50th gate.
But we can experience something without losing our sense of self. That's the chiddush. We want to be able to experience the generality, the general unified source from which we came.
Not in its totality, but we can experience a part of it though. I feel like if we can experience it in its totality, then we've lost ourselves completely again. Like we understand that there's an experience happening.
I think we're saying the same thing. Yes, we're saying the same thing. Yes, we're saying the same thing. And this is the idea of the soul, of the neshama specifically, that layer of the soul is this layer which is hovering between the individual and general, between the prati and the klali. It's not in the head, it's hovering above the head. So just to quote this section from the Yerushalmi, this is in the third parak of Sanhedrin, and the Gemara says something very interesting. It says that when Moshe was on Sinai, so lamad kol halacha v'halacha mem tes panim lakan umem tes panim lakan. That every single law that Moshe learned, he was taught 49 interpretations this way, meaning to arrive at one conclusion, either the conclusion of like kosher or not kosher, valid or invalid, right? Every single possibility, he was taught 49 ways to get to the kosher conclusion and 49 ways to get to the not kosher conclusion.
Why?
To demonstrate the full spectrum of possibility of interpreting the Torah. And so Moshe comes to God. He says, "Lilmod halacha anitzarech." I just need to know the answer. Like I don't need to know all the possible interpretations. I want to know the answer. And so God says there is no the answer. That's the whole point. There is no the answer. The point of Torah as a process is that the people will bring an interpretation and will extract a conclusion. That is the point of Torah. The point of Torah is not for me to give you an answer like definitively.
All sides of the diamond are the diamond. There's not one side that creates.
Oh, there you go. That's good. I like that. All sides of the diamond are the diamond. So the nun is highlighting this very idea, that the ability to experience the general unity through any specific point of entry, through any specific thing, meaning through the individual, through any individual, right? You're able to experience the infinitude of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? That surah ha'elokis, the divine form that is in each individual, is an access point to the Creator Himself. Through every possible interpretation of a halacha, you see an access point to the full range of possibilities of any interpretation. That's the idea. This is mamish what's going on in Sfiras HaOmer right now. In Sfiras HaOmer, we're told, it's interesting because this is even alluded to in the language of the mitzvah itself. What's the way that the pasuk communicates this mitzvah to us? It communicates the mitzvah tispru chamishim yom, that you should count 50 days. How many days do we count? You don't count 50 days. You count 49 days, right? But that is the point. The point is that 50 is not another number. It's not another number.
Something to unpack.
The 50 is the coming to the realization that each one of the numbers is just an access point to the same thing. So you don't count number 50. 50 is when you're at Sinai already. You're at Sinai. The 49 is just it's circling around the bush, so to speak, until you realize, this is what I've been looking for the whole time. Each individual is an access point to the klali, So as this conversation is getting very, very heady and very philosophical and theoretical, as is the nature of the topic to begin with. There's no that. To try the best we can to bring this down a little bit to practicality. No, don't bring it down. No, we want to bring it down. We want to get each one, right? We want to be able to, right?
Meet all 49.
Just to emphasize, just one more note on this idea, because a lot of times these things can sound like numbers games, and they're not games, because in the end of the day, it's not numerology in the sense that, the numbers because people approach the numbers from the opposite direction. They approach it, okay, well, I have the number in front of me, and the number must mean something. It's very like code-like. It's right like numbers in computers when you're coding in computers, so the numbers mean something. But in the realm of Kodesh, it's the exact opposite. There is a theme, and the number is just trying to describe that theme. So it really needs to be approached from the opposite way. So we see that the idea of 49, or sometimes phrased 7 times 7, is the idea in Lashon HaKodesh and used by all the prophets to describe the idea of the full spectrum of possibility. Right? Like the pasuk from Tehillim, right? Imras Hashem, Imros Tehoros. The speech of God is our pure utterances. Kesef mezukak ba'alil la'aretz, silver that has been forged and purified thoroughly. Mezukak shivasayim. It's been purified 7 times over, 7 times 7. 7 times. I mean, it's been purified as much as it possibly can be purified. So the idea of 7 times 7 is always communicating this idea that it's the full range of possibility. And the biggest cycle that we have in the Torah of time is indeed 7 times 7. The Omer is a miniaturized version of that, where we have 7 weeks, right? We have 7 weeks. And in the year version of that, in the macro version of that, we have 7 Shemitah cycles. We have the cycle of 7 years, and then we have 7 of those cycles, which produces the Yovel, the 50th year. So the cycles that we have are always cycles of 7 and then 7 times 7. Again, connoting the full range of possibility. Just a note on that, just to clarify that. So I'm reading here from the Maharal in Perek Lamed Aleph of Netzach Yisrael. The theme that the Maharal is talking about right now, he's darshaning the famous Rabbi Bar Chana stories of Maseches Baba Basra in the 6th parak of Baba Basra. There are these escapades of Rabbi Bar Chana, who was a Chacham in Eretz Yisrael about the 4th century, and he has these crazy wild escapades in different places, and he meets different characters, and he sees crazy animals and has crazy experiences. So it tells over these experiences. Now, obviously, it should just be taken for granted that these are not meant to be describing physical, literal experiences of the world, but rather they are all symbolic and archetypical stories. And anyone serious, please forgive me for being blunt, will interpret the story from this perspective. The Gra has many writings about these stories. The Maharal takes apart the stories, obviously, in his Chedushei Agados, but in Sefer Netzach Yisrael, he's approaching it from a specific angle and how it relates to Matan Torah specifically. But there's a specific point that he brings about that I think is very, very relevant to our conversation. So he quotes from the Gemara, "Beperek Hamocher es Hasfina," which is the 6th parak of Baba Basra. Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Li Ahutaya, Ta'ach ve'lach Tur de Sinai. I was wandering around and I met an Arab shepherd, and he said, "Come, I'm going to show you the mountain of Sinai." Also, the Hadran le Akar akrava v'kaime ki chamarta chivarta. It was this very, very intimidating scene of this mountain that was surrounded by giant scorpions that were the size of donkeys. Shamati baskol sheomeras, and I heard a voice emanating out from Sinai that said, Oy li shenishbati mi meferli. Woe unto me, referring to God, meaning God is saying, woe unto me that I have sworn to send my children into exile. Ki asay lekiblayo d'Rabbanan. When Rabbi Bar Chana went back to the masters, Amrule kol Abba Chama b'chol Bar Chana sichsa. He says, you were a fool that you didn't respond to God's cry. Havalach lemeimar mufarlach. You should have said, God, I rescind your vow. You vowed that you would send your children into exile. I rescind it. Don't worry. You got right. This one's on me. You could bring the exiles back. Yeah. So the details of the story is not what I think is relevant to our conversation, but specifically the fact that there is a conversation between Rabbi Bar Chana and the masters. After Rabbi Bar Chana has this crazy experience of seeing the mountain, seeing these giant scorpions, he comes back to the Rabbanon. So says the Maharal, very, 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 very fascinating thing. Amar ki Rabbanon, Perush, Ka'asher ha'imitztaref ha'asaga zos el ha'asaga yoser pashut. Asher ha'asaga ha'klalit nikres Rabbanon. When his individual grasp of the situation came back to the general grasp, which is called the Rabbanon, the masters. V'lakach ha'halacha kerabim b'chol makom. When we say that there's a machlokas between an individual chacham and all the other chachamim, we say that the halacha is like the rabbim. Right? We rule like the opinion of the majority. Yeah. That's why the general consciousness is called the Rabbanon in the story. That's why it's called the Rabbanon, because it's the general consciousness, the collective consciousness, universal consciousness, having a conversation with Rabbi Bar Chana, the individual consciousness, meaning the individual subjective consciousness of the individual experiencing the world through their subjective lens. There is a conversation going on between the individual subjective experience and the general universal perspective. That's what it means that Rabbi Bar Chana and the Rabbanon are having a conversation. Yeah. So what is the takeaway over here? The practical takeaway from the story is that every individual needs to go around and have their experiences and have their crazy escapades and then go back and have a conversation with the Rabbanon. How does that happen? How does that take place? Some people can have that conversation in their own mind, which is what the Maharal says was going on with Rabbi Bar Chana, that he was literally having a conversation in his own mind between his subjective experience and the more universal consciousness that he had inculcated. That's one possibility. That's a little bit more advanced, I think. An introductory step to that is to literally go and have a conversation with Rabbanon, which was a practice that used to be very common in the Jewish people, called a chabura. People used to do this all the time. People used to come and sit together. Today, maybe it's called a fabrengen or a isvados, but this is a very old practice of the Jewish people. Right? It's referred to already in the Nevi'im, right? Chaver and Makshivim. You used to sit with your friends who would listen to you, and they would give you feedback. And and God Himself would sit the Chosev Basefer. He would be like writing down the notes of the meeting. It's very powerful. But this was the baseline goal for such an experience, that each person would give over their insights from the experiences that they had, and they would get feedback from the collective. And that feedback from the collective would put into sharper focus or clarify the significance of the experience of each person. And that is the conversation between the Seichel HaPashut, right, the general, unified, universal consciousness, and the Seichel HaPrati, right, the grasp of the individual. And that is literally the Shar Hanun. It is accessing the 50th gate through the perspective of the 49, through the perspective of each individual. And this is a practice that can be inculcated. It just takes practice, like every practice takes practice. Be inculcated, it can be honed, it can be sharpened to the point where we could be like a Rabbi Bar Chana, where you can have that conversation within your own mind. You can, right? You can consult, right? The Seichel HaKlali, right? The collective universal consciousness that you've already inculcated. That shouldn't be done as a total replacement for getting feedback from people, but it is a tool that you can literally develop within your own psyche. And this is the Musar. This is the Musar that comes from the Nun. Bezrat Hashem. Sorry? Does Nun